Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We're going to get into the Wayback Machine and we're going to pretend like it was 1 hour ago because you had to go to a podcast. And it wasn't this one.
No, I had a podcast before and then I was on some conference thing. Actually,
Right.
Design Ops Global, by the way, Peter Fossig's organizing this great thing over, not in Manchester, virtual this year, but check out Design Ops Global. Really good stuff.
Right. So you did have something else to do. You were doing and being fabulous somewhere else. And so we delayed our intro recording, which is what we're going to do now. And enough of all this nonsense. Who are we talking to?
So today we have the lovely Kathryn Simpson and her book called Leading for Change.
And what were your takeaways, Marcus?
So my takeaway, because we talked about change about a lot, but she had some really lovely stories there. The main one for me was where she was talking about having been in a change project for quite a few months and having had the impression that she had communicated well, because communication is really important. And then when she had a follow-up meeting, people were going, yeah, can we please talk about why we have the teams we have and why we're doing this month into the project? And she was a bit shocked, but at the same time learned really well about the fact that you really, really should tell people and help them understand why you're doing what you're doing. Because the second they understand the why, they're more likely to go with you and actually implement transformation and change. So that was my biggest takeaway, because I think, I like to believe that 50% of success in transformation and change is communication, probably same as in leadership. And she just confirmed it with one of her anecdotes. So that's my main takeaway. What about you?
And she also said during that story that it's important that you don't forget what you know. I mean, she was actually failing to follow some of her own advice for leading change, but it allowed her to spot that and immediately correct that and move from the role of a leader to the role of a facilitator and to really uncover and explain the word why. My biggest takeaway was the idea that you really should, working in a diverse group, make the most of differences. And the best way to do that is ensure that all voices get heard and that there's a safe space for people to be able to share views, whatever those views may be, whether they're agreeing or whether they're dissenting sort of views. But you have your views. I have my views. I bet she has her views. So what should we view?
We should view and listen and then comment and share on the interview. Hello everyone, today we're here with Kathryn Simpson. Hello Kathryn, and thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here, Marcus.
So as usual, we start at the top. So Kathryn, please tell our listeners who you are and why you wrote the book.
Okay, well, I'm a practical consultant, I would say, because I've walked the line between organizations and consulting in my career, and I finally landed on the consulting side of the line. I have a scientific background, and that's really enabled me to build on my strength in creating rules and logic and process and structure. And then all of that has been built on when I realized that actually what makes the difference is people. And, it's the change that people make that really sticks. And that's the side you have to work on to make change happen. One of the things I really value is that collaboration with the great clients I work with, and I love to be able to leave them with the skills as well as the practical results that are very important to me. I've lived in Canada as well as the UK, and I have 2 grown-up children who now teach me much more than I teach them, which is absolutely amazing. So why did I write the book? Well, originally when I set out, it was all about, everybody told me that this will build your business. This is a great way to build your business. You should do it. You've written lots of blogs now. Get out and put those all together and write a book. So that's how I started. And then as I was writing it, it transformed a bit because I thought what I'm doing is actually celebrating with some amazing leaders who I've worked with the great projects that I've done. And so, very grateful to have worked with such amazing people. And so it was great. And so that celebration has been a part of it for me. And again, feedback that I've got from people who I've worked with has meant an incredible amount to me. And then I guess the other thing that's also important is to be able to share with upcoming leaders and those future leaders, maybe some of the practical tips so that they don't have to wade through lots of theory and, try and figure out how that all applies. I really enjoyed, just being very practical and very simple.
Lovely. And I think that probably gets me then to my first question. So I can relate to the book writing. It's maybe a lonely endeavor, but it sort of tends to change while you're at it. And I remember I probably rewrote mine about 3 times because while you're writing it, you realize what you're actually doing is maybe something different than you set out to do. So in terms of the leaders, and obviously that's in the title. So when we talk about, let's talk about vision and leaders, and you work with a lot of leaders. Tell us a bit about leadership and vision and what your experiences is, what people are asking or what you do and how you help them in that respect.
In terms of vision, yeah, and it's it's very different. Everyone comes as, I've just recently done a project, for example, where the leader was very clear about the vision and where he wanted to go. And so the work that we were doing was really about, well, how can the rest of the organization buy into that change? Because that's actually quite hard work, doing that once you've decided that this is what it looks like with such clarity. Other people end up saying, well, I've got a general idea of this is where I want to go, but I really do want to get the input, and I really want to have a vision that works for the organization, but also to give me competitive advantage. So how do I combine those things? And so there's a bit of, let's understand what the landscape is that you're working on, and then let's carve out how you can best realize a vision of the future, and not get to the vision being a very impractical, it's pie in the sky, it's an idea that has no grounding in reality. And for me, that's really important, is to have that grounding and have a grounding that's based on many people's perspectives.
Yeah.
Mm. I think it's more the process that you go through, and to talk to people about what their, actually it's both their individual aspirations and how they see that, and then the talking to them about their current reality, and then blending those two things into, well, what could that look like for the vision? So it's very much a conversation where you collect a whole bunch of perspectives and reflect and bring that back to people, that they then get motivated and excited between that, as you say, the stretch, which could be it's very out there and inspiring and different, but it's also I know how to take the first step, and it starts to get practical, because You talk about the where we are, you talk about the future, and give it a bit of a timeline, and then say, so what is it we need to do next in order to achieve that? So having those conversations with, either the leaders or the team that you're working with is essential.
I found in a lot of projects, and especially taking from the experience around change and transformation and what kind of visions and goals are set, that one of the trickiest things is that you need to do these things while the organization is still running, right? So the famous, like, trying to change the wheel while we're driving down the road. How do you get leaders to not too quickly? And I've seen this in a lot of scopes and descriptions of transformation ambitions, where in the end, all that was done, or the ambition only was at fixing often old IT boxes, or just, polishing and painting things a bit in a different color. Because seemingly that was what was needed tomorrow. Otherwise, we're not going to be competitive. How do you get leaders to say, right, yes, we know, but the bigger vision is to actually have a bit more of a step change. A vision should be further out. How do you help balance that? Or is that, who's normally driving that? Are they receptive like that? Is that actually something that happens on the leadership level, but then further down, it might not trickle down like that? I don't know. What's your experience in those kind of things?
And again, just varies. I'm thinking that, I'm thinking back to actually the challenges of doing that when I was in an organization. So I remember the detachment to go and do the strategy, which I do think is important. So that's one of the things, isn't it? Is kind of go into a different space, going into a different event, going into somewhere where you can have that thinking that you're not sitting at your desk almost to do that. And even online, and we can talk about that later if you like, but it's how do you create that space to think more long term and strategically and so on, so that you can think that big picture. So you kind of create that space. And the reason then I was thinking, well, that's all well and good, but the number of times that you hear the horror stories of, okay, we did all this great work. That was fun, wasn't it? We did an offsite and fun, came back. Oh my goodness, now I've got a budget to deliver. Oh my goodness, now I've got somebody who's, had a personal challenge, so I need to deal with that. Oh, we've got performance reviews due. Oh, we need to continue to, as you say, fix a problem. We've just had a problem in with that customer, so we need to go over that. How do you kind of then say, okay, well, that was very nice, that stuff over there, but hey, I've got things I need to deal with right now. So I guess one of the tricks and one of the tools, and there are many, of course, but one of them is when you leave that session of the offsite or the virtual offsite, you always have what's the very next step. And what's the very next step? Because then it's practical and then it's small, and then you can actually say, okay, as well as all of these urgent things, I've also got this little thing here that I need to do. I'll just take that first step and to do that. And you put in place things like, well, how are we, even again at the offsite, how are we going to make sure that this really happens and have that common understanding? We're going to hold each other accountable to this. We're going to have meetings that will be around implementation, and we don't just leave this because our job as leaders is done. We've created the wonderful and great vision. Now someone else can just pick this up and run with it, which again, I've seen sometimes. So that's some of the thoughts. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you hit on a really important word there, didn't you, in terms of prioritization? Just so important that people prioritize and they're able to, within that, and that goes right down from individual. I'm learning how to say no and no gracefully because I've got other things prioritized, and the organization saying, you know what, this is our number one priority or two. And all of these things are really lovely to do, and the rest are not there. So you asked about hiring. So hiring, like any other skill, is for me is big on the behavioral interviewing almost. There's two components to this, but let's start with that behavioral. So the individuals. So if I was in an interview situation, so going back very practical to that, tell me about a time where you had to change course very quickly. What did that look like? What did you do? How did you do that? So kind of getting people's thinking and experiences so that you can see that and you can validate that and you can understand the size of the change and how quickly they really did have to change. You can dig into those conversations. So I would be definitely building those kinds of questions. But I also think that, again, it's really important for, and I learned this again in one of my organizations. I took over a leadership of a team that was around operations. It was very much grounded in the status quo. And low risk, we have to we deliver training and documentation and so on, so we have to be very risk averse and we can't quickly change on that. And then you get a leader like me, who my boss is, as I have been described a few times in my life, as a change junkie. So I see a shiny new penny and off I jump. I'm on my way to go and change and fix it. And so there's this spectrum of people. And one of the things that I learned in my time leading that team is to really value those people who were very risk averse, because they can identify all of the issues with what the change is. And they will say, this change won't work because of da, 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 da. Okay, let's understand all of that, because you need to actually manage all of those risks and figure out what those are and how you're going to do it. So it's good to have that balance. But to your point, you hire the right balance, right? And making sure, but when you hire people who can see issues and problems and risks and are averse to change, they can be some of the biggest supporters, but the biggest enablers, I guess, in getting a change that will actually work. So that was my one point in terms of, get the right people. But there's also something where I have a little bit of a challenge with expecting people to be resilient all of the time. That, you keep knocking people back and they have to bounce up, and you keep knocking them back and they have to bounce up. And to create, for me, I think a leader's role, a leaders in change role, is to create an environment where it doesn't feel like it's just change after change after change. So you're coming back to your original question, Troy, around, how do you prioritize? And that's what needs to happen is, leaders just need to be saying, what, I'm adding something, but by the way, I'm taking this off. And how can I help you to deliver this? What are some of the barriers? So kind of, and for individuals to be able to rise to that challenge. So, long-winded answer. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks. So, it's always good to have a couple of anecdotes, I guess. Um, I think that's I think all three can relate to the whole shiny penny thing, and there's a certain amount of change and keep looking for the new thing, keep trying things, keep experimenting in people. However, at the same time, so a couple of weeks back we had Jeff Schwartz from Deloitte in, and he did a lot of research on human capital, and they just brought out a new research paper that actually showed interesting number, or scary number, so to speak, around the perception of leadership on how much they expect people to learn new things, and actually and then interviewed people at the same time. So they interviewed leadership and people in teams of how much they're willing to learn for their job, and how comfortable they are with that. And the number deviated significantly. So leadership seems to not quite expect people to be willing to learn, whereas people are actually quite willing to learn, not only to keep their job, but also because they want to improve, they want to have a better ways of working. So they're quite positive towards it, and there seems to be a gap in leadership. So when we're saying like what kind of skills do you hire, what kind of skills do you unearth in your existing workforce? So what's your experience or strategy or conversations you have with leaders on that when that comes up? Because I'm sure it always comes up to, keep the amount of people you might have to fire small, and keep the training quick and effective, or hire new capabilities, right? It's always a conversation. So what do you experience with transforming who's already there and making use of that? So my question is, apart from hiring the right capabilities or the right skill set in, what about activating new skill sets in existing people? What balance do you strike? What recommendations do you have? What experience do you have with leaders and how they perceive this, and how they might want to implement it? Given that a study from Deloitte has shown there's a discrepancy between leadership thinking there's less people who want to learn, and actually people in companies more so actually want to learn. So there's a gap. What's your experience and leadership views on this?
Yeah. And I guess it's often not my, in terms of actually building specific skills. I wouldn't say that's necessarily my experience. But I always have an opinion, so I'll give you that. And I think it's really that most leaders don't want to fire people. I think they want to keep, because there's a lot of pain in all kinds of ways. The people who are left behind, for example, it doesn't create a resilient organization. So I think that's the first thing. And then I think that, that's really interesting, the finding from Deloitte. And it's a real opportunity, isn't it, for leaders to tap into all of the skill sets that they can possibly have, and really use those skill sets for the benefit. I do think it's really important, I'm a big component of the why are we changing anyway? That's that leaders have to answer that question, and not just answer it, but help their people understand it. Because that's often why people don't change, is because they don't, like, why are we changing again? And I do remember again a story where we talked as one of the teams that I led once. We talked as a team about why, and I told them why and what we were doing. It's a brand new team, brand new department. I told them what, I told them why, I told them how we were going to do it, what the milestones. I thought I'd done a great job. And so we checked in about 6 months through the year, and I said, okay, let's have a check-in, see how we're doing against our goals, anything else anybody wants to do on our offside. And somebody said, could you just tell us why this department was created? And I thought, oh my goodness, am I supposed to be a change manager, a change leader here? I haven't followed my own previous advice as a consultant. And what we did is I stepped into facilitator mode and we talked about the why. I helped them understand why is it that this team was, and they had to think about what the external environment was telling them. They had to think about the internal environment. They had to think of all of these things so that they could then say, and at the end of it, it was incredibly gratifying because someone came along and said, Kathryn, no matter what it is you want me to do, you just tell me. Like, you just tell me, I'll do that. And I was thinking, whoa. So the difference in the switch there between someone who was kind of, I'm not really sure why I'm doing this and what I'm going to do. And yeah, I'll do what you tell me to all of a sudden, this is a goal and I understand why I'm doing it. I'm going to do, like, I could do this and this and this. So I may have been perceiving as a leader that this person either didn't have the skills to do this or they didn't want to learn the skills. Well, in fact, what it was, they didn't really see the reason why they should do. So, that's stood me in good stead a lot of times. And when, if we go back to the original conversation we were having about, how do you get people to buy into a vision? That's often how you do it, is that people have to understand, so why are we shifting? We're pretty good as we are right now, or don't really see the need of doing that. So to kind of create that internal why, not just tell people about it, is the challenge. And that's how, I think as well, you build on the talent you've got.
And obviously the feedback of someone who's bought into the why is very, very clear.
Yeah.
I've got one last question for you, and because unfortunately we always have more questions than we actually have time. And I don't know if you've been following the headlines lately, but there's been a big story about Basecamp, which is in the US. And they came out with some new policies with regard to their employees and whether or not they were allowed to have discussions about political topics kind of within the company. And it resulted in 30% of the employees resigning.
Wow.
Now, one of the things you talk about in your book is the importance of making differences work. And right now, there are really strong, polarized differences that may or may not be productive in a work environment. What can you say about making differences work? And what might you say, if you have been following at all, the Basecamp story, about how they might have done that differently?
Yeah. And I haven't followed, so yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a very topical question, isn't it? I take, again, I come back to my pragmatic view of, how do you get everybody's voices heard around the table? That's how you make difference of work, is everyone feeling like their voices are heard. So how do you do that? Well, as a facilitator, and the kind of the leader is part of that duo, if you like, of leader facilitator, however that works. One is you show that you care. Two is you can use different technologies to help to get people's input. And you do make sure that you kind of create that environment and have some rules around that environment about, well, what would it look like to have a great meeting? What would be our goals in doing this? And how do we have to behave in order to achieve that and get a group agreement on what that looks like? So I don't know, having not followed the story, whether that actually would have been helpful if people had agreed, what is it that we're trying to achieve out of this, and how do we need to behave in order to get to that? And what tools are we going to use? When are we going to have a facilitator? Because when it's complex and emotional and political and all of those things, then boy, that's really difficult for a leader to kind of contribute and share their vision, as well as try and facilitate a process. So those would be some of my thoughts.
Well, that's really, really good. It turns out that in the article, they did say that they were getting an outside facilitator to come in to support them through this transition they were going through as a company. So it sounds like they may be headed in the right track. But on that note, like I said, we've run out of time. I want to thank you on behalf of Marcus and myself. You've been an excellent guest, and we wish you great success with your book.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.